Hello, everyone, and welcome to the 6th edition of Exploring Enterprise, the podcast series from the Enterprise Research Centre. I'm Stephen Roper, Director of the ERC, and today I'm joined by colleagues from the National Innovation Centre for Rural Enterprise, or as we call it within the family, NICRE. Professor Jeremy Phillipson is Director of the Centre and based at Newcastle University. Janet Dwyer is a co-director of NICRE and based at the University of Gloucestershire, and Melanie Thompson-Glenn is NICRE's Business Development Manager. Welcome everyone to this podcast. Today we're going to talk about how rural businesses have fared during the COVID pandemic, some of the challenges that they face, and what the future might hold for them. So Jeremy, let's start with thinking a little bit more about rural businesses. How do they differ from urban businesses, and why do we need to think about them as a sort of special case within this kind of post-COVID era?
Well, thanks very much, Steve. Well, I mean, within NICRE, we're essentially, by rural enterprise, we're actually meaning the full diversity of enterprises that we find within rural areas. And they actually make up 1 in 4 of the nation's business stock. So this is a really significant part of the business population. And we're not just talking about businesses linked to farming or the environment or kind of land-based businesses, though these are very important and a substantial part of many rural areas. And probably for most listeners of the podcast, this will be the first sort of businesses they'll think about as rural enterprise. But really across most of rural England, rural enterprises are much more likely to be in sectors like wholesale and retail, in professional and technical and scientific services, manufacturing, construction, the whole host of sectors that you would also find within urban areas. So there's this similar sort of variety within rural economies. But there are distinctive characteristics, and we're trying to get underneath those within the centre. So higher shares of self-employed and sole traders, much fewer very large businesses, and a much more significant share of employment in micro and small businesses. And many more rural enterprises are sort of family-based and also based from the home. So it's these sorts of characteristics which pervade the operational model of rural enterprises. And of course, they're also set within a rural context, and that presents certain challenges for the business environment and also for their workforce. You know, we can talk about levels of affordable housing, public transport provision, digital and physical connectivity. So it's the circumstances around rural enterprise which we're really trying to get underneath within NICRE.
And we'll talk to Melanie in a few minutes about some of the business-facing activities that NICRE is pursuing. But Janet, you've had many years of experience, if I'm allowed to say that, working with rural communities and conducting research with rural stakeholders. So tell us something a little bit about what NICRE is doing in those kind of partnership relationships and how that can add value to our understanding of rural enterprise.
Yeah, okay. So yes, I've spent quite a bit of time working on more community-based and social enterprise types, and these are quite distinctive in rural areas, and they're also linked to some strands of policy that have been around for a while. So one particular initiative is called LEADER, which I've been evaluating this year, which is multi-actor bottom-up rural development initiatives, generally pretty small, micro businesses often involved, often with an outlook which is about trying to improve the quality of life of people in rural areas. So one might be dealing with private businesses who are obviously oriented towards growth and making profit, but they also have a specific interest in supporting the wider community. So, for example, a shop with a cafe facility, which becomes a bit of a community hub, providing a kind of social support mechanism and networks for people who live in areas where, because of their rural nature, they can't otherwise so easily meet with other people.
And Janet, I think one of the things that we think about as rural areas is the sort of diversity of rural areas themselves, some more adjacent to cities, some much more remote rural. Are the challenges that face businesses in those different areas also very different?
Some are and some aren't. I think all businesses face some of the same challenges in respect of the way the economy behaves more broadly. But I think the point that Jeremy made earlier about infrastructure is very important in a rural setting. So a lot of things that one would take for granted in an urban setting aren't necessarily going to be there in a rural. And they will take a bit more creative thinking to overcome the challenges of therefore having to operate in these circumstances. And the more remote you are, basically, the more creative you probably need to be in respect of how to organize supplies, organize distribution, think about networking, think about all those needs that a small business has on a day-to-day basis. And it's not just the objects or services that you're offering, it's also your workforce. They have to be able to get to and from the workplace if they're working in a situation that requires them to be on site, or even if they're working remotely, there can be issues in respect of the infrastructure quality. I mean, we still have issues with broadband provision in rural areas, which get worse the more remote you are. And that's probably one of the biggest and most frequently cited obstacles that small rural businesses will come up with when you talk to them about the challenges of working in a rural setting.
Thanks, Janet. Melanie, I think that one of the key aspects of NICRE is actually trying to support rural businesses themselves in a very active and hopefully creative way. You're leading on this work for us. What's some of the main sort of strands of that activity?
Thanks, Steve. I think one of the key things that we're finding with rural businesses is that we talk about innovation, and this has been a key element through COVID, but actually lots of rural businesses don't feel they're very innovative. They think of innovation as being something that other people do, that's very technical or very digital, and don't think about that, excuse me, everyday innovation. So I think one of the things that NICRE does is we do a number of things, but I think we run innovation projects, and these are showcasing those best practice things that are happening in rural areas. So it could be with a group of businesses. So we do a lot of work with Food and Drink Northeast, and that is a group of food and drink businesses. And they're doing some really innovative things and working together and pulling together new networks and finding new markets for their businesses. So, for example, during COVID, the food businesses who would normally sell directly to the restaurants that were closed, they pivoted very quickly and they were selling over a digital platform to consumers. We work with communities, as Janet's described there, and community organisations, and help them. The idea of the practical projects that NICRE does is that they're pilots. So they're pilots. They're bringing together best practice that we can pull together in toolkits and share with other businesses and other communities across the country.
Yeah, if I could add there, I think something that we've picked up, haven't we, Steve, is this tendency for rural businesses to be thinking ahead a bit more in respect of the net zero challenge. So one area where in the regional surveys we've run, we found that rural businesses are more likely to have thought about their carbon footprint and to be thinking in, how are we going to reduce that in the years ahead? And that in a sense is a kind of innovation because it's something that everybody else is going to have to get to grips with over the next decade. So being a bit ahead of the game is really important, I think. And I think this may be because of the rural location and because of the challenges that it throws up for those businesses. It's kind of got them thinking perhaps ahead of others about the transition that needs to.
Melanie, please.
I completely agree there, Janet. One of the programs that we're running at the moment is Just One Thing, and it was there to bring in, so for those businesses that were thinking, my goodness, this is a very big thing, we've got COP26 going on, how do we get to net zero? And there's this net zero challenge. And actually, if we all did something towards net zero, there are businesses who by their very nature, probably without offsetting, can never get there. So the NICRE Just One Thing challenge really is around businesses sharing what they're doing. And it's about bringing together a community of businesses and organizations who are all doing small things and some very big things, but are sharing that knowledge so everyone can grow and accelerate that journey, really.
I think one of the things that we've learned both from the Just One Thing project and a lot of the work that Janet's done previously is about the power of peer learning in these kind of situations, where it is very much about one business giving another business the confidence and highlighting a route forward about how they can develop. And I think that's particularly important perhaps when businesses are very much working in isolation, as they may well be doing in many rural areas. Jeremy, let's come back to you. I know one of the big things the big projects that NICE has been engaged in this year has been the sort of State of Rural Enterprise survey, which covered the 3 home regions of the centre, the Northeast, the West Midlands and the Southwest. We're about to publish the first, or you're about to publish, NICE is about to publish the first tranche of findings from that survey. Give us a little bit of a heads up of some of the kind of key things coming out of that, would you?
Yeah, thanks very much, Steve. Well, I think, first of all, it's really a significant survey that we've undertaken. We're really keen to provide a much more fine-grained understanding of the kind of needs and prospects of rural enterprises, and even to give a picture of the impacts of the COVID pandemic on rural firms, because that picture really hasn't been revealed so far within the national data. So it is really hot off the press in terms of that picture. And what we find really is that, although infection rates from COVID have been generally higher within urban areas, this isn't synonymous with the impact of the crisis. So both rural and urban firms have been significantly impacted. So just to give you a couple of statistics here, so 42% of rural firms experienced decreased turnover over the last year as a result of the pandemic and the control measures that were put in place. About 37% reported mainly negative effects. And it was quite interesting that similar proportions of rural and urban firms actually were impacted by the social distancing regulations in terms of the impact on their business models. It's not all a kind of negative picture though, and we do see quite a lot of significant evidence of rural resilience coming through in the data. And actually the most common response from rural businesses was that they experienced both positive and negative impacts from the pandemic. Rural firms were actually less likely to be severely or adversely affected by the pandemic than urban firms in terms of their performance. So consistently more likely to have been able to maintain or increase their turnover, or even to have generated a profit. And I think this does kind of lend itself to a picture we've seen before in previous crises of a kind of rural resilience and adaptation. We do see that coming through in the data.
So we're recording this conversation in December 2021, and we're just about at the point of becoming very concerned about the Omicron wave of COVID. I was probably a little bit optimistic saying post-COVID before, but what do you think the implications are then, Jeremy? I mean, given the findings around rural resilience for the survey, do we need to worry about rural enterprises as we go through the next wave of COVID, or will that resilience kind of carry them forward through that effectively, do you think?
I think we do need to be concerned. I mean, we saw, as I say, in that data, it's showing significant levels of impact. And the resilience strategies that rural firms themselves adopt have consequences. I mean, rural businesses themselves tend to rely much more on kind of family-based strategies to get them through, relying on household labour, digging deep into the household reserves. So yes, it's resilience, but it also has potentially secondary unintended consequences, which in themselves might need some attention further down the line.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. And it's also, there's a spatial element to this as well. So the same impacts might be felt by rural and urban firms, but when your firm is the only employer in a particular local area, a big impact on that one firm makes a much bigger difference than it would do if you were surrounded by a lot of other employers. So, many smaller villages might have 2 or 3 businesses in the village. If one of those gets badly affected, then obviously it'll have a more significant and visible impact on the community as a whole. But having said that, I think what we see is a lot of businesses having to cope with extreme swings, because in a rural area, tourism and hospitality is quite a big sector, and that's seen these massive swings. So from the lockdowns to the kind of sudden opening up and then a kind of almost overload. I think that's been a really important phenomenon. And from our early survey findings, I think we found lots of businesses developing coping strategies for that. Jeremy, you wanted to come in?
No, I was just going to add in a point about business advice. I think this will be significant going forward as to how the advisory landscape will kick in helping firms continue to adapt, but also pivot their business models. It's quite notable from the data that only less than 10% of rural businesses have actually turned to a business advisor during the pandemic. And I think there are some kind of alarm bells there about, or at least a question about how in the future we should evolve business advice so that it reaches rural and urban firms. Only a quarter of them said that, if they were thinking about, what would have been valuable during the pandemic, a quarter of them did say business advice, but only 10% of them actually turned to business advice.
That's right. I think there was evidence that they were relying more on networks, wasn't it? Because I think a lot of them will be networked with other businesses, and they'll be sort of, as you were saying, Stephen, using peer-to-peer learning as a way of trying to share best practice and adapt successfully. But business advice is certainly something we need to look at in a bit more depth, I think.
Melanie, you have been working very much with companies around innovation as an element of their kind of resilient strategies during the COVID period. Have there been great examples that you've seen there of companies and the way that they have innovated to sustain their businesses over that period?
Absolutely. I think as a business advisor for the last 25 years, I was really heartened by the fact that very quickly into the lockdowns and the pandemic, we saw some businesses pivoting super quickly. For example, we have a business in Northumberland who delivers boogie bounce. So it's trampolines, keep fit, and the lady goes around dozens and dozens of village halls, so across a very wide rural area. So the minute obviously lockdown came, that business literally stopped. But within a week, she had said, right, you can hire a trampoline for £40 a month, because she had all of this capital trampolines lying there. And she's pivoted a business model, and essentially you paid a fee for a week and she would put 5 different classes on. And now, as we're coming out, hopefully, of the pandemic and, things are opening up again, her classes have started again. But equally, she's now diversified into a group of people who never wanted to come to a class and bounce with other people, or couldn't, or, their work didn't allow them to come at those times. So she now has this extra income stream, and it's absolutely no problem. So we've had things like that. We've had businesses, as Janet said, we've had a lot of hospitality and tourism businesses who literally were just floored. So there was a caterer, for example, who specialised in wedding catering. That stopped immediately. But they started doing veg boxes for the village that they lived in and the surrounding areas, because the one shop was having problems with supply. They've then bought a food truck, and they're offering kind of a lovely high-class takeaway element right around the valley 5 nights a week now. And when I had a conversation with them the other day about would they go back to wedding catering, actually the answer was probably not. So we're seeing businesses who probably for the first time, sometimes in the entire lifetime of that business, they've had time to sit back and reflect. They've had time to look at their business model and say, actually, is this the right thing for me to do? Or could I innovate slightly and adapt it, and it suits my lifestyle more, and it's more profitable. So we've seen some fabulous examples across the country. We've seen, I've been doing some work in Southwest, and the Grace Network set up a whole new organisation in their social enterprise family, which was around last mile deliveries around Stroud. So e-cargo bike deliveries, giving young people work experience, but delivering for big businesses like Stroud Brewery and equally down to small bakeries. So we've seen some fantastic things, and I really hope that as the pandemic continues and we get out of it and get back to some sort of normal, that this innovative thinking from businesses will continue, really.
Yeah, if it's not too awful, it is great to see these businesses bounce back in this kind of way. And I think it has been remarkable to see some of the stories of entrepreneurial activity during the pandemic, and the extent to which and the speed with which many small businesses have pivoted, both in rural and urban areas, but absolutely. And that's been really, I think, one of the more inspiring elements of the whole sort of pandemic period, really, in a sense, and does suggest the kind of robustness of many entrepreneurs, as well as the kind of communities of which they're a part. Jeremy, did you want to come in with a comment on
I
this
just
point?
think that the examples Melanie's given are just the tip of the iceberg of this kind of seismic market innovation that's happened throughout the pandemic. And we do see it coming through in the statistics from in the State of Rural Enterprise analysis. So it's actually over a third of businesses diversified, and of these, more than half actually developed new sales channels, and 2/3 of them actually diversified their customer base. So this is really significant. And there was no evidence that rural was somehow lagging behind urban areas in terms of innovation, similar levels. And that actually plays out in the wider innovation analysis that we've done within NICRE, so not just in relation to the COVID pandemic. So I think it's really pointing to this message that rural enterprises need to be taken more seriously within an innovation landscape. It's not to say there aren't innovation challenges. I know, Steve, some of the analysis that you and Maria and co and Sir Al have done within the Enterprise Research Centre are pointing to some underlying weaknesses in rural innovation, especially among the more kind of micro business end of things, and also in the more remote locations where there tends to be less new to the market innovation. So although there's a positive story and there's innovation to be harnessed within rural areas, there are some issues to be addressed within innovation policy.
Janet, if we thought about sort of agricultural businesses in particular, I mean, they've clearly been influenced very strongly by COVID, as have all companies, but also faced the additional challenges of Brexit and the changes to CAP and ELM and the agricultural support policies. Are we seeing this pattern of innovation there as well?
I think we are, but it is a little bit different. I think agriculture in some respects was initially less affected by COVID than other businesses, because people still need food, and the supply chains were still operating from the farm to the retail, obviously with some challenges once we started to get that wider impact on supply chains of a lack of people to actually do the distribution. But I think businesses have been innovating because of the uncertainties of that situation you've just described. It's still not clear how much money will be available and in what forms in the longer run for farms in England in particular. The situation in Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland is that the change is happening slightly more slowly, so people have a little bit more time to adjust. But I think what that's doing is it's bringing people up short. As often a farm family business will be thinking, well, we need to plan for the next 10 years, and we actually don't know what the situation is going to be like over that period. So they're having to build in a kind of resilience into their business planning and their orientation. So they're trying to reduce their dependence on subsidy because they don't know where it's going to be in 5 years' time. They know that there will be big changes and that the subsidies they've had in the past will disappear, but there are supposed to be new ones coming on stream, but nobody knows the scale or exactly who will be eligible. They're also thinking as well, I mentioned the net zero thing earlier. There's been a big drive for innovation in farming around net zero. So thinking about, should we be changing the way our farm is organized? Should we be thinking about more mixed farming methods? Should we be looking at new techniques that will help to increase the carbon in our soils or increase the carbon that we sequester from our above ground features? And then there's quite a bit of thinking about the way that precision agriculture will transform the whole landscape for operating a farm business in an efficient and competitive way in the future. So I think there's lots of very interesting sources of innovation going on in the land-based sector.
I think it's very interesting, Janet, the way that the sort of regulatory environment on the one side and on the other side, the sort of technological advances that we're seeing with automated vehicles and drones and all the rest of it is actually kind of coming together in a sense to drive innovation in agriculture at the moment. What are the kind of constraints on that going forward? I mean, is this about capital, is it investment, or is it about the understanding in the rural community of how these technologies can be used? What's the kind of constraint there, do you think?
I think one of the big constraints is knowledge and support for the best kind of advice, because it is about rethinking the way in which you orient your business. So there's been a kind of business as usual steady pattern of growth and development in agriculture, which may well not serve people well in future. So just getting bigger, cutting your costs, trying to gain your economies of scale and specializing doesn't work well in a high risk, high uncertainty environment. And actually more mixed enterprises and more complex systems may well have greater resilience. And I think that's so it's the mindset shift that becomes very important. Of course, access to capital is important too, and there will be businesses that have more freedom on that front than others. And there's a lot of evidence that micro businesses, small farms who currently very dependent economically on the subsidies, will have challenges in raising the capital they need if they need to make a big investment for a shift. They are asset rich but income poor, and that's not always the best perspective or the best offer for a lender. Having said that, there are new opportunities within crowdsourcing and other kinds of innovative finance, and there are people now interested in investing in the land-based sector as a result of partly the whole net zero shift, which offer opportunities.
Fascinating landscape, Janet, I think, going forward. Jeremy, Melanie, I didn't know whether you wanted to comment on sort of some of the barriers to innovation among other rural enterprises, or perhaps just pick up any of the themes that Janet was mentioning there.
Yeah, I mean, I think Janet's points are very well made. I do think there's maybe a bigger structural issue that needs to be considered, and that's really to what extent is the innovation landscape actually sufficiently connected, and to what extent is it actually engaging with rural enterprise. I mean, this is as we've said, micro businesses, home-based firms. I think traditionally they've been very difficult to connect into the more kind of formal innovation structures. And that's one thing that we're trying to do with NICRE in the way that we work, is connect universities with policymakers, but also with rural enterprises, and to make those relationships much stronger. And that's not about pushing out technology. It's about jointly developing and innovating between rural businesses and expertise within universities too. So it's about making that innovation system work much better for innovation.
We've covered a lot of ground over the last half hour or so, but maybe just to kind of round up the conversation, I might ask each of you to say what's the sort of one or two things that you'd really like to see in terms of rural policy over the next year or two. And Jeremy, you might want to come back to some of your points about business support or anything else. Melanie, why don't we start with you? Just, I don't know what your priorities would be in terms of sort of supporting rural businesses over the next couple of years.
I think I'm going to pinch Jeremy's business support one, because that is my kind of passion, and it's what I think we're missing at the minute, is that truly kind of accessible and appropriate business support for rural businesses, which is delivered on a very local level by somebody that those businesses trust. And I think it's having an advisor where the business doesn't have to travel to an urban area to access that support, because they won't. It's having someone who really genuinely understands the challenges of running a business in a rural environment. So my call to government really is to put that support in, that rural growth network started in that pilot scheme. So we have the rural hubs, which is fantastic, but I don't think they're utilised properly or most effectively, and is to put a network of advisors in that can do exactly what Jeremy was just describing there, is linking into the much bigger business support landscape that is there, which I think at the minute rural businesses miss out on.
So Jeremy, Melanie's stolen your first
typical
idea, but what was there some other thing that you would want to see?
I mean, one of the primary motivations for NICRE was that, this feeling that rural enterprise was somewhat underutilized or under-acknowledged within mainstream economic and enterprise development. So I think my closing remark would really be around levelling up. There's hugely significant policies coming on stream, and it's really important that rural enterprise is visibly and strategically embedded throughout levelling up programs and investments. And that's not just to address the kind of rural challenges that we've talked about, but also to make sure that we're capitalizing on rural enterprise for wider benefit, whether it's around green growth or wider prosperity. So for me, it's about embedding rural enterprise within the levelling up agenda.
Janet.
Okay, so I would want to say something about trying to join up the way in which we approach business support between the farm and the non-farm sectors, because as a result of leaving Europe, whereas we've had a generation of agriculture being treated almost as a separate and a special case in respect of the support mechanisms around it, we're now in a situation where a lot of farms are actually quite diverse businesses. They may be producing food, but they're probably doing a whole load of other things that are of benefit or of service or of a commercial interest in the wider community. And what we don't yet have is a business support and advisory network that can cross that divide effectively, it seems to me. A lot of the needs in the land-based sector are not that different from the needs in other small micro businesses, but they're not used to tapping into those services because they've never done that in the past. And I think that a kind of related to that, I've been doing a bit of work for the OECD on labour and skills needs in the farm sector. And it's very interesting, the extent to which these are both global trends, but they're needs that are about this joining up of the dots between the farm and the non-farm in how you think about workforce and skills needs and planning. So there are big needs for new skills in land-based businesses, many of which are similar to the sorts of needs that have been important for micro businesses and small businesses in other sectors. And sector skills planning has not been addressed in the same way in the farm sector as it has been in other sectors. So I think there's a real opportunity there. And the more that we can see land-based businesses as kind of multifunctional and not just about one thing, and look at their needs therefore across that range of different enterprises that they're engaging with, I think the more added value we will be able to give both through policy and through the support networks themselves.
I think there's a really challenging agenda there, Janet, and that's all very exciting and very positive. Jeremy, might just give the last word to you to say a little bit about what's coming up with NICRE, and then perhaps come to Melanie in a minute just to say how people can actually find out a bit more about what's going on in NICRE and what the contact point would be for people who are listening who might want to know a little bit more about the work of the centre. But Jeremy, why don't you say a little bit more about what's coming up over the next month or two?
Yeah, we'll certainly watch this space. I mean, the analysis from the State of Rural Enterprise survey is hot off the press, so we'll be producing the first release of that this week on the COVID data. We've got plans in the new year for analysis around infrastructure needs within rural areas to get at some of those farm, non-farm business issues that Janet's been highlighting. I think the final thing would be that I think the data is really showing quite a lot of regional and local variation, so it's very difficult to come with aggregate patterns and comparisons when you realize that the circumstances of rural enterprises are differentiated at a local level. And this is really pointing towards that need for a much more differentiated and locally sensitive approach to economic development. So we'll be producing some analysis and data on that front, hopefully early in the new year.
Sounds fabulous, Jeremy. Thanks. Melanie, how do people get in touch?
We are just redoing our website at the moment, so there will be a new website in January, hopefully. So yes, at www.nicre.co.uk would be great, or follow us on either Twitter or Facebook, and you will get all of the latest news and the latest activities that we're taking part in.
Thanks, Melanie. That's ideal. So everyone, thank you very much for your contributions this morning. It's been a fascinating discussion. Clearly plenty of work for NICRE to do over the next few years. And we've heard, I think, some fantastic stories about rural innovation and rural resilience. And we may need all of that resilience over the next few months as we look forward to the next wave of COVID. We are past our time. Thank you, everyone, for listening to the podcast today. If you enjoyed it, come back and listen to episode 7, which will be around the food sector and will have a rural dimension, I think. That will be January. And if you want to find out more about the work of ERC, you can find more on our website at www.enterpriseresearch.ac.uk. Thank you, everyone, and we look forward to joining again next time around.